So now it's time to take all the information we have, everything we know about natural selection and DNA and biochemical evidence, homologous anatomical structures, everything that we've fossils included, everything that we've talked about in the last videos, and tie all the pieces together to look at the complicated part, perhaps the part that's the most quote-unquote unbelievable for some people, the macroevolution. How can we fit all the pieces together and look at eventually get an idea, as we saw with fossils, these evolutionary trees. So just as we saw with fossil organization, that you can place fossils in approximate relative dating and place them in a sequence, an order of sequences, to actually see and infer evolutionary relationships, we can do that with organisms just by looking at their differences and similarities, their physical aspects. And if we go a little bit deeper, we can actually even compare DNA, as some of you did, or actually all of you did in a previous task. So with all of those things, aspects and everything we know, essentially what it comes down to is comparing organisms. And when we do this, if we organize them based on their similarities and differences, we can create what are called cladograms, and then in turn go a step further and create these evolutionary trees, or phylogenies. So let's look at a really simple example of one and get an idea for how they work. So here are a bunch of organisms. You can see that they all appear to be creepy crawly bugs, quote unquote, if you will, although technically they're not bugs. But we can see that they're all pretty closely related, yet they are different. Now notice they're arranged here on it almost looks like a timeline, and we can see these circled letters here and branches. This is actually a way for us to, we can create, this is called a cladogram, or a form of a cladogram, so that we can, and actually a modified form of a phylogeny, so we can, each letter, write in defining characteristics and features. We'll get an idea for how that works in a second. And this will show who or what is more closely related. Now this, again, an important note, this is a cheesy example here, but I picked a really simple one to try and show these relationships. So the way that they work is that at each letter we write a defining characteristic that separates the organisms from those around it. Now, well, what does that mean exactly? What we're implying here is that at each letter, if we write in an organism, let's say, a characteristic here at letter F, what that means is that after we pass over the letter F, that trait that we've written here is true for every single organism that comes after on the timeline. So with that in mind, the characteristics, let's go ahead up here and jump all the way up to letter H, if we focus on letter H up here. The characteristic that we're implying evolved or developed at some point in time here, at letter H, has to be true for every organism. In this case here, this moth, has to be true for this organism after, every organism that comes after, but did not exist in these organisms beforehand. So in doing that, what we could say is there had to be a characteristic that would has arisen here at letter H, that was evolved, that makes this guy a little more advanced. Now we could do that with any letter here along the timeline, be it letter H, be it letter G, any characteristic here. So let's go ahead and let's look at just a really simple one. Again, this is a simple example, letter C here. Now the characteristic that evolved here at letter C has to be true when we're comparing these organisms here, and not for any of the others. So what we're implying here is that if we look, every organism after this, the ant, the cricket / grasshopper, the fly, the dragonfly, and the moth, all have what we could say 6 legs. And the critters that are on here before, remember, this is just so we can try and sort out evolutionary patterns here. The organisms that came before did not have 6 legs. So maybe perhaps that's a trait here. We can see that all the organisms after that have 6 legs. So kind of standard in what we're trying to do here in implying this. So I'm going to state that go ahead now and pause the video and just look at the screen. See if you can go ahead and come up with some other characteristics here that you could write in. Some of them are pretty easy, some of them are a little bit trickier rather, but see if you can do that. Okay, hopefully you did pause that and you had a chance to do so. You may have said something like just one set of wings evolving maybe here versus 4 wings in total here. Maybe at letter H, really well-developed furry antennae that didn't exist here, although these guys do have well-developed antennae, they're not furry. Things of that nature. This guy, everybody here, if we did letter C, a great one to have here would also be 3 body segments. Each one of these organisms after this have 3 clearly defined body segments. Tough to see here because his head is tucked under, but where before that this guy only had 2, and this guy doesn't even, well, I don't know what his deal is. This cartoonish, freakish caterpillar. But in each one we're doing that. Now, why would we do that? Ultimately, our main goal is so that these can help us hopefully try to show evolutionary relationships and common ancestry. Because if we relate these ideas, this comparison and this cladogram, we can put them together and get what's called a phylogenetic tree. Now, a tree, like a family tree, is exactly what that's implying. Now, phylogeny refers to phyla, or in one singular term, phylum. Each one of these phyla is one individual group of related organisms. So when we say this, and this is kind of a messy example here, what we're implying, if we put them in a tree format, that as we advance upward, we can see different groups, different classes in most cases, of organisms evolving and branching out. And actually within this, we can see evolutionary the process as a whole. It shows evolutionary relationships, how the closer you are on this timeline, the more closely related you are, the more you have in common. Like this guy right here, an opossum, and this guy, the chimp, are both mammals. They're both furry. They both give birth to live young. They both breathe with lungs. They're pretty closely related, where this chimp and, let's say, a bony fish down here, Finding Nemo, not as closely related. Yes, they do have eyes, but breathing is different, body structure is different, reproduction is different, circulation is different. So this is helping us to show, as we said, these evolutionary relationships. As time went by, the organisms on this timeline developed more and more advanced traits. So again, as what we're looking at, we can see more primitive organisms earlier on, and as we evolved, we accumulated these adaptations and these more advanced traits. And in a more scientific version here, this looks a little overwhelming, and it's got a lot of nerdy words in here, but each of these up here are not all the phyla, but the major groupings of the kingdom Animalia, of all the animals. Now, we would belong over here in Chordata, spinal cord organisms, along with fish. You can see lizards or geckos. Chimps would belong there, whales, mice. But from our previous screen, some of those quote-unquote bugs that we were looking at, flies, crickets, moths, dragonflies, they belong over here in the phylum Arthropod because they have different characteristics. So we can see here, this also shows major, although these are nerdy traits, major traits and characteristics that through evolutionary time evolved to allow these organisms to branch out and become their own species and their own groups. Now again, it does look a little bit nerdy and it may be a little overwhelming. Just remember that, think of it as a timeline. As this tree develops and grows, we get more and more branches and more differentiation, more specialization. So in closing, these phylogenies here, the key thing we have to remember, they're really an evolutionary tree. The closer you are, the more closely related you are. And the more close you are, the more recently in evolutionary time you branched out or separated from a common ancestor. Because we got to remember the false premise of, oh, well, humans evolved from monkeys. No, we did not. We evolved at some point in time from perhaps a common ancestor that we can see through the fossil record. But the argument of, well, if we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Well, that's a great point, because we didn't evolve from monkeys. Monkeys and humans branched out evolutionarily, excuse me, a tongue twister, over time, over hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, in fact, if we go back and look at common ancestors. Which brings us to our last point, that there, in essence, using this fossil analysis and phylogeny, there are two major big ideas that we started to actually see a little bit in the fossil organizational activity that you did in class. The two competing theories of evolution, and they are really two schools of thought, but they're radically different. One is the idea of gradualism. That says that essentially organisms evolve very slowly through a process of slow, constant change. Another way to look at this, think natural selection over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, where we increase small steps, add on these evolutionary changes to show gradual loss or gain of structures. And the easiest way to look at this, again, here we're looking at these moth slash butterfly images, and we can see that a common ancestor here's a great example to back up the humans and monkeys, that these two species did not evolve from one another, but over gradual time, if we look at the differences, and this is, again, time over here is a very important factor, they accumulated these differences so that we can actually end up seeing something that's pretty darn cool here. In that these organisms, as they accumulated differences, they branched out and eventually became two very, very different species. But if we go back in time, if we can hit rewind, we can say at some point in time they shared, and this could be again through the fossil record, through what have we, a common ancestor. That did have some of the traits that these guys have. I mean, they both have antennae, so did their common ancestor. They both have wings and coloration and an abdomen, so did their common ancestor. But they've accumulated through, most likely, natural selection, these differences to make them two very, very different organisms. Now, the other idea is slightly different. Very quickly, though, punctuated equilibrium. And that's saying that at one specific point, or points along the way, species evolve very rapidly, then stay the same for a long period of time. We can think of this, perhaps the best example would be due to mutations. We see, now here's our gradualism, but to compare that differently, this species is going along and suddenly there's a mutation where, bang, this guy becomes very different, and now these two no longer mate. There's a different species. And again, a different mutation and a different branch acquires totally different traits. So now this guy no longer mates. So we can see that in this pathway we actually end up with 3 different species versus 2. It's the same general premise. We can see a branching tree, but they end up very, very different. If you think about it, which one would you believe in? Gradualism, punctuated equilibrium? Hard to say. Evolutionary biologists do find both of them interesting. Some think just gradualism, some think punctuated. Personally, I think it's probably a little bit of both. Why can't it be both? We know we have mutations. We know we have natural selection and gradual changes. Probably a hybrid of both. Which brings us to our final point. These two different types of evolution. Convergent and divergent. Convergent is one that's a little strange, can be tricky. And that is the acquisition of the same biological traits, but with unrelated lineages, meaning that basically two different creatures end up with similar traits just because of the environment they've grown up in. Like, best example, think whale and a fish. One is a mammal, one's a fish. They're very different. They do not share ancestral lineages, evolutionarily speaking, but they both have fins, or what look like fins. They both have tails, and that's just a result that they've converged. They've come together with these traits just because they both live in aquatic environments. Now, most of the evolution we think of is divergent, and that's like what we just looked at, this gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. We accumulate differences between groups that leads to the formation of new species. And a great example that we can see right now in history is the eastern and western meadowlark, which we'll look at in a second. So, really quickly, convergent evolution, here's a great example. A fish, a reptile, and a mammal. Not at all really related, but you can see they have some very similar traits. Tails, pectoral fins, dorsal fins, mouths, eyes. They are not related in terms of evolution and ancestry, yet they have evolved convergently, these similar traits, all because they are aquatic, and this guy's extinct. So this is a little bit different. Divergent means they're separating. Eastern meadowlark, western meadowlark. You can see they're pretty similar, but due to a very small change in just their voices, their songs. They no longer can mate with one another. They attract different mates. They have branched out or diverged to become two different species. Now, if we can fast forward down the line, they may evolve to become very, very different eventually under gradualism. Hope that helps. And now we've got the big picture of evolution. Bang!